So, with Legion Alpha hitting test realms and MMO Champion doing their data mining, I wanted to go through the discovered Affliction Warlock spells, artifact weaponry, and the talents thus far, as well as some predictions with their future direction. Just as a disclaimer, this is the first iteration of Alpha we've encountered, and so these are by no means set in stone and are almost guaranteed to be changed before next summer with Legion's launch. Some quite substantially, I predict. Also, the glyphs were not announced yet, so we're not going to go over that in this video. Before we begin with the talents, some brief spell changes to Affliction thus far. Unstable Affliction, most notably, is now an 8-second dot that consumes a soul shard. Basically, it's Devouring Plague of Shadow Priest. Reapplying it will extend the duration indefinitely, so long as you have the shards to spend. And if the target dies, the shard is refunded. And of course, it has the same silencing debuff if dispelled. Drain Life is to replace Drain Soul as the primary filler. Drain Soul in its current form is basically a combination of Malefic Grasp and the old Drain Soul. Basically, it's Malefic Grasp with the Drain Soul animation, but the primary filler will no longer tick your applied dots when dealing damage. Whereas when Drain Soul ticks right now, it does 50% of the dots tick damage. This means that they're going to have to buff dot damage on its own in order to be viable for a single target, which also means excellent multi-dotting again. Next thing that's pretty big is Dark Soul is gone as our main damage cooldown. Blizzard said it's probably going to be replaced with a more frequent Doom Guard on like a 3-minute timer or something, but they haven't really fleshed this idea out yet, so we have no idea. Soul Burn is also gone as far as we can tell, at least there's no mention of it yet, and based on the abilities that they have brought forward, they don't have any empowered versions of them, like Soul Burn would indicate, so no more empowering abilities. Seed of Corruption is now the empowered version by default. The empowered version is when it applies corruption to all the targets it hits. That is now the baseline for Seed of Corruption. Haunt is no longer a baseline ability. We'll get into this a little bit later, but it is now a talent solely for nuking. It no longer applies the debuff, and again, more information later. Another thing to be aware of is that the dot durations have decreased by 30%. Unstable Affliction is now 8 seconds, down from 14. Agony is now 18, down from 24. And Corruption is 14, down from 18. Which means we're going to be refreshing dots a lot more often. We're also not sure yet if the Pandemic is still a thing, the 30%. Pandemic, if you don't know by name, is the passive ability that allowed us to extend the duration of our dots up to 30% of their baseline duration. And so I'm hoping that yes, this is still in the game. And if it is, then extending the dots will bring them back up to their old durations, if extended precisely. With their shorter baseline durations, this also means that there will be a tighter window of refreshing the dots. What was a 7.2 second window for Agony is now reduced to 5.4, and Corruption's 5.4 is reduced to 4.2. Alright, on to the Deadwind Harvester, Uthalesh, which is Affliction's artifact weapon. It's essentially just a talent tree granting new abilities, modifying old ones, and an overall grand old time the deeper into the trees you go. For every artifact weapon, the tree starts with the solid yellow border, which for Affliction is Souls of the Damned. Every time you kill an enemy, your shadow damage increases by some percent, and it also doubles the other effects of the Harvester, Harvester being the artifact weapon. My question is, how long does this effect last? We'll probably have to wait until we get our hands on it or to figure it out, but for any sort of ad-killing type fights, this is going to be a very, very useful talent. The second part of it is Tormented Souls periodically attempt to escape the Harvester, and killing them refunds 10% mana. These souls are probably going to be very weak and you'll be able to kill them very easily, but it wouldn't be worth a global to slap an Agony on it because you'll be netting 7% mana for a global with a minor chance for generating a soul shard. Whereas the flat out life tap restores 30% mana for 10% life and just one global. So what else can happen with this? We don't know until we see it, but if others can see them and whoever kills them gets mana, this will be a good boon to healers to help them regen. If others can see it but only a Warlock gets mana, then random cleave from the raid will probably be the main means of killing them. And if neither of those are the case and only the Warlocks get to see them, then it'll help offset Seed of Corruption mana cost during AoE. But just from what we know now, I think we're just going to ignore these cluttering health bars. Alright, after the Golden Border talent, then we move on to the first Dragon Border one. These are all supposed to be very, very special. Our first one is Reap Soul. It is a new dot. It has a 2-second cast time, and it deals damage every 5 seconds for 42 seconds. Increases the dot frequency by 6.66%. Ooh, 666. Each time it deals damage, which results in 12 ticks over the 42-second duration, focused towards the end of the duration. And on screen, you'll see a little bit of a graph showing the intervals in between each tick leading up to the 42 seconds. Now, I'm assuming, based on the description alone, that it resets every time you cast it, similar to the way Agony used to ramp up in its damage before it got its new 10-stack mechanic. If that's not the case, then I'm 99% sure there's some internal minimum frequency, so that if you refresh it before the end of the duration, it won't just decrease to infinity ticks per second. There'll be some sort of minimum if it retains it through refreshing. If it's not refreshed, and it does reset, then with the lack of snapshotting now, this means that you'll want to time your procs, or any sort of damage buffs that you can control, with the last 10 to 20 seconds of the dot to get the most ticks for your buck. Long term, and potentially even before this goes to beta, I foresee this dot adopting some sort of similar stack mechanic that Agony now has. Once it reaches X amount of stacks, it ticks every 2.5 seconds or whatever, incentivizing you to keep it up as much as possible, because having to apply a fresh one will severely hamper the damage it does. They changed Agony for a reason. This suffers from a similar problem, although maybe that problem is less so now that there is no snapshotting. But anyway, before moving through the rest of the tree, let's look at the other Golden Dragon Border talents. These are the ones you should be aiming for, the really big ticket, important, massive, impressive ones, apparently. Rumor has it you'll get one of these every tier throughout the expansion, and I'm going to start with the one on the far right. Harvester of Souls. Your drain spells, meaning drain life, drain soul, have a chance to trigger on all targets afflicted by your corruption. Trigger what, is my question. I'm guessing it sounds an awful lot like the old Harvest Life talent from Mists of Pandaria, which made drain life suck from all the mobs around your current target, except in this case it's anything afflicted by your corruption, and it's only a chance to proc, not guaranteed. But I think the main focus of this talent will be for any sort of 2 or 3 target or some sort of multi-dot fights where you will randomly drain from the off targets in addition to the main target, which, actually sounds pretty cool. However, with the really short dot durations and the almost constant refreshing we'll be doing for multi-dot fights, squeezing in a good drain life looks difficult at present. The next Dragon Border is Soul Flame. When you kill a target, its soul bursts into flames, dealing Shadow Flame to everything around it. Why Shadow Flame? Why can't it be Shadow? This is literally the only thing that is semi-fire based in Affliction now. Just make it Shadow. So it's bonus damage for multi-ad fights. It slightly incentivizes you to finish killing a low HP ad over guaranteeing a full cast on another target to ensure that this explosion hits as many targets as possible. And I do mean slightly. Basically, it's just extra damage. Don't really need to change what you're doing. On to the last one, Wrath of Consumption. Killing an enemy causes your dots to deal some % more damage, and the ability stacks up to 5 times. So we get free damage on ad-based fights anytime something dies with our dots on it, and thanks to Seed of Corruption, this should be easier than ever. But then again, we'd like to know how long it lasts. Alright, so moving through the tree now. Hideous Corruption increases damage of corruption by 6% up to 3 times for a total of 18%. It's pretty straightforward, flat damage buff to corruption. As an aside, preemptively, as you go through these talents, I think all of these 6% 3 times talents are really just placeholders for the actual values yet to come. And in general, take the numbered values with a grain of salt. They are probably 100% the thing to change if anything changes. Next talent is Compound Interest. Each Agony and Corruption you cast increases the damage of your next unstable affliction by 10%. If you're in a dry spell between procs, spread your dots as much as you can. This will incentivize you to hold onto shards to build this buff up, potentially even when you are capped on shards, to save the buffed unstable affliction for a burn phase or align with some significant proc to come soon. Next talent, Long Night of the Dark Soul. Increases the healing of your drain spells by 20% up to 3 times for 60% total. They're buffing drain left and right. And oh yeah, locks are becoming indestructible. I don't know if I mentioned that yet. Next talent is Fatal Echoes. When your Unstable Affliction expires, it has a 25% chance to reapply itself. Statistically, this saves you an extra soul shard every 4 casts of Unstable Affliction. However, you can't use it when you want to use it. I would rather have this talent give Unstable Affliction a chance to refund the shard on cast or upon expiration rather than waiting to see if it'll reapply itself before falling off. That said, casting a new one and overlapping isn't a problem because reapplying the dot simply extends the duration, as mentioned before. But you used Unstable Affliction to take advantage of some buff or proc in the first place, and that buff will probably have faded by then. So the second free application will just be a depleted version without procs that you don't really want to go out now, especially if this reapplied one steals the compound interest stacking buff from reapplying your other dots in the meantime. On the plus side, the inherent design of Unstable Affliction means you don't have to worry about the target dying either, because it will just refund a shard upon death. Another thing I think Blizzard could do instead of a new application, second to simply just giving us a shard outright of course, is extend the duration instead of letting it fall off and reapplying it. Extending the duration keeps the current compound interest buff and prevents it from stealing the newly generating one, but for simplicity, just make this a chance to refund a shard instead of reapplying a dot. Mere Flesh reduces the damage you take by 6% up to 3 times, 18% total. It's just straight damage taken reduction. Again, locks are indestructible. I don't know if this is intended to replace our damage reduction cooldown as well. No word yet if Unending Resolved is still available or not. We will see. Inherently Unstable increases the critical strike chance of Unstable Affliction by 6%, up to 18% total. Pretty straightforward. Drain to a Husk increases the damage of your drains. Drain life, drain soul by 6%. Again, not sure if all these are just placeholders or what. Also straightforward. Inimitable Agony. I had to look this word up. It means so good or unusual as to be impossible to copy. Unique. Increases the damage of your Agony by 6% up to 3 times. So it's a refined version of Agony, which deals more Agony. Again, self-explanatory. Sweet Souls has the same icon as Long Dark Night of the Soul. Your Hellstone fully heals you. That is pretty cool. Any party member using a Hellstone also heals you for the amount they were healed, which I think is 20% of their life. So raids are to stack more locks. Again, locks are getting indestructible. I don't think this will go live in its current state. It's just too overpowered. You have 19 other players in a Mythic raid who should each be using a Hellstone during the fight. Now, given that a few will probably not be during times that will benefit you, like tanks or some random targeted effects, but when there's raid-wide damage, you will undoubtedly always be topped. I predict the raid-wide effect will be reduced to 25 or even 10% of the amount healed. 100% of the amount healed is just too good. Perdition increases the critical damage, not critical strike chance, of Agony, Corruption, Drain, and Unstable Affliction. By Drain, I assume they mean Drain Life or Drain Soul. They're starting to introduce critical strike damage. Except for Chaos Bolt, always critting, and the critical strike chance increasing its damage. Essentially, it's crit damage at that point. This is another feature borrowed from Diablo. I have a suspicion that critical strike damage might start to appear on gear as the stat that replaces multi-strike. Multi-strike, they said, felt like just another crit. Well, this buffs your crit damage. So maybe this is the other stat that they're going to start using now. Seeds of Doom increasing the detonation damage of your Seed of Corruption by 10%, up to 3 times for 30%. They're really trying hard to make Seed of Corruption good, and I'll get into my gripe with this later. Shadowy Incantations increases your shadow damage by 6%, up to 3 times for 18% total. This is probably the best talent in the whole tree. It will be the first talent I'll be shooting for personally, as it flat out buffs everything, and it does so multiplicatively. This is currently the only source of increased shadow damage we have, as Mastery increases the 3 main dots damage only, not shadow damage. And so this 6% of flat out shadow damage is worth more than 6% to any specific dot, like Inimitable Agony for Agony, Drain to a Husk for the Drains, Hideous Corruption for Corruption, and even the crit chance for Unstable Affliction. And as all Affliction abilities are now shadow damage, adding 1 talent here is worth about 4 of the other talents. So this one should be prioritized, at least in its current form. By the time this goes to beta, and probably especially live, I think it'll be reduced to about 1% per talent or something less significant to the dot-specific talents. Again, it's just too good in its current form. Now, assuming that they keep it the way it is, the quickest path to get there, points-wise, is to go through Inherently Unstable, Sweet Souls, and unfortunately through Seeds of Doom. If the golden dragon portraits don't require much more effort, then probably the best path would be to head up through Hideous Corruption, Compound Interest, Long Dark, Night of the Soul, and then one more picking up Soul Flame along the way. Alright, moving to the talents. In the first tier, the level 15 talent, Haunt is going back to the old 15-second cooldown with no more shard cost, similar to Pre-Miss of Pandaria. Although I think during that time it was a shorter cooldown, like 8 seconds or 12 seconds. Feel free to correct me. If the target dies, the cooldown is reset. There's no mention of the increased dot damage debuff that it has now, so it's not a debuff recast anymore, it's just a nuke, which makes it feel an awful lot like Shadow Priest Mind Blast mixed with a little Power Word Death cooldown reset mechanic. Writhen Agony. Agony may now stack up to twice as high, so up to 20 stacks instead of just 10. However, with Drain Life replacing the current Drain Soul Malefic Grasp mechanic that makes the dot ticks extra, it means that Agony will not ramp up as quickly. Also, you're going to have to probably refresh it twice before the full 20 stacks are realized. This is killer for the initial pull damage, as 20 stacks won't be reached until after all your procs have faded. Although Affliction always was a back-end heavy spec, then again, executes are no longer a thing, so I would like this a lot more if it also doubled Agony's duration, so that it could actually ramp up to 20 stacks with a single application. Drain Soul replaces Drain Life and generates a soul shard if the target dies while channeling. So basically it's Drain Life plus shards on death. We'll have to wait and see if it provides some additional bonus damage, or else this will pretty much be only viable in fights with a lot of adds dying, because more shards equals more unstable affliction, means more damage, etc, etc. Tier 2, the level 30 talents. Contagion. Unstable affliction also increases all the damage you deal to the target by 5%. Pretty straightforward, align with cooldowns, and from there, keep it as close to 100% uptime as you can. It puts a lot more emphasis on soul shards, and therefore the Drain Soul talent, as well as multi-dotting Agony as much as possible for churning out more soul shards to spend on Unstable Affliction. Absolute Corruption. Corruption is now permanent, or 60 seconds for PvP. Just have to say, that's pretty cool. Dot you'll never have to refresh again. Hashtag save the globals. It will be better for fights where the boss is untargetable for a period, like Assault or Iron Fell Reaver, or when the player is ported elsewhere, like in Gorfian or Archimon. Any instance in which your dots will fall off, especially with a new shorter duration. It'll also be weighted more heavily for multi-boss fights, especially 3 to 4 council fights, again, saving those globals. This talent for Corruption makes me reminisce about Wrath days, when Blizzard implemented Shadow Bolt to refresh Corruption, just to keep it up during Heroism. The duration of the dot would shrink with your haste, not add more ticks with the same duration as it does now. Haunt did refresh it, but Haunt had such a long cooldown that it could not keep Corruption up during Heroism, so you'd be stuck refreshing it during the burn phase almost constantly. And later still, they made it refresh with ticks of Drain Soul during Execute. Drain Soul also refreshed Unstable Affliction too. Of course, this was when Drain Soul only ticked like every 3 seconds, and so it was really, really cumbersome to maintain the 3 dots. Haunt, and don't forget the Soulfire buff, and also try to weave Drain Soul effectively. Mana Tap. Spend 40% of current mana to get 15% increased damage for 20 seconds. Sounds interesting, kind of like the Life Tap Spirit-based Glyph in Wrath. Current mana encourages you to bottom feed your mana pool. Combined with the Glyph of Life Pact for the decreased mana cost of your spells, and Drain Life is your new filler to mitigate the 1% per second life cost. You can pretty much do this as needed to maintain the 15% damage buff. Otherwise, you may find yourself doing this and life tapping immediately after to get enough mana to cast your damaging spells. 1 global to keep this buff up is definitely worth it, but I'm not sure if spending 2 globals every 20 seconds is. Then again, we used to hardcast Soulfire every 30 to 40 seconds in Cataclysm to keep that modest haste buff up. So maybe 2 globals and some life is worth it. We'll see what the Sims tell us. Tier 3, Life Leech. Drain life, drain soul, grant a shield for 30% of the damage dealt. Pretty much same it is now, except no Haunt. Mortal Coil and Howl of Terror are the same, except that Howl of Terror is Affliction only. Which, before the new talent system, it was embedded in the Affliction tree anyway. Tier 4, Siphon Life is back as a dot, not just as an effect of Corruption and later Immolate. It deals some amount of damage over 15 seconds, healing you for some amount of damage each time it deals damage. I started in Wrath, so I was astounded to hear that the Siphon Life talent back then used to be its own life-stealing dot. Well, it's back. And so, taking a look back at the dots we now have Corruption, Agony, Unstable Affliction, the new Reap Soul, and the old Siphon Life. Affliction has more dots than ever. That is if you don't count the Shadow Flame Cone as a dot. Sow the seeds. Seed of Corruption will consume a soul shard if one is available to embed a demon seed in 4 additional nearby enemies. No thanks. My biggest gripe with seed, and this is what I was talking about before, is how long they take to explode. Currently, you can get a few seeds out by casting them yourselves before the first one finally explodes. In order for this AoE to be viable, they need to make them instant kabooms, not this after the target takes some amount of damage, then it explodes bullshit. Or make the dot version tick a lot quicker so they explode sooner. If they did either of these, then maybe I'd be more interested in Affliction Burst AoE. Till then, I'm just gonna multi-dot it up or roll Demo Destro for Burst AoE fights. Soul Harvest. Channeled spell to restore 5 soul shards. We still don't know what the soul shard cap is. I'm hoping 6 for demo's sake, but this kind of hints at only 5. Basically, it's the old soul harvest mechanic from Cataclysm. It's similar to a mage evocate to be used during down phases, so that you gear up for the next active phase. I fully expect them to take the regeneration spell effect and give it back, yes, I said back, to soul harvest where it belongs. Tier 5, Demonic Circle. This one I'm salty about. They took Demonic Circle from being the baseline ability and turned it into a talent, which is fine, but that's not really adding a new talent. It's really just shifting our current abilities into talent. Burning Rush, nothing new. Speed boost at cost of health. Dark Pact, same thing. Shield for pet or self-health cost. It's interesting for this tier as a whole that it has such a wide range of talents. You have position management from the circle, mobility from Burning Rush, and a defensive cooldown. It's very strange coming from the themed tier system we have now. Normally the mobility is on one level with the defensive on the other. The ongoing theory is for us to choose offensive or defensive priorities for the new challenge modes, which sounds a lot like running 50 plus greater rifts in Diablo, where you start to prioritize survivability over the raw damage output. Tier 7, the Grimoire, is pretty much the same. Supremacy doesn't give a new demon anymore, it just buffs their damage and health. Service is the same. Sacrifice is a bit different though. It doesn't just buff the damage you deal, it instead deals a little extra shadow damage to the target and all others within 8 yards, making it probably the choice for AoE fights. Tier 8. This tier is amazing, or at least one of the abilities is. Soul Effigy. Create a soul effigy bound to the target, only you can see it. X% of all the damage taken by the effigy is replicated on the original target. It's a fucking voodoo doll. And only I can see it. Are you sure I ain't the one going insane, not the Shadow Priest? This ability is Affliction only. And with this talent, it means that you'll be able to get the benefits of long-term multi-dotting on a single target fight. Every fight is now effectively a council fight for Affliction. I have 2 contingent predictions for this talent. One, if it's 100% or more of all damage, which I think is unlikely, then you will debuff the boss and focus fire this little scarecrow. You will probably stick it in the middle of the encounter room so you can hit it from all angles. No more outranging the boss due to charge mechanics, it going untargetable or whatever. And you'll be dumping your Unstable Affliction on both targets with your damage procs. If it is less than 100%, like say 70% or 90% or anything less than 100%, then you'll just slap your dots on it like you would any other council fight and focus fire the boss again. You will not be using Unstable Affliction because you're not getting the full damage for the soul shard cost. Unless you're absurdly rolling in shards, you'll save Unstable Affliction for the boss. Fell Hunters might be back to doing increased damage based on how many dots you have. 50% per dot, up to 5 dots. And the Soul Effigy, assuming Pats can attack them, would also provide a stable target for your melee-based Fell Hunter to chomp away at. The next new talent for this tier is Phantom Singularity. Place a Phantom Singularity above the target, which consumes the life of all enemies within 25 yards for some damage every 2 seconds for 16 seconds, healing you for 30% of the damage dealt, and it has a 1 minute cooldown. Basically, cast this, cast seed, cast seed, cast seed, AoE, AoE, AoE. Now, based on what this talent is kind of aiming at, I think this is what should replace Seed of Corruption as your primary AoE. Buff its damage a little, remove the cooldown, and make it a channel, and just let us dump Seed of Corruption, please. I really do not like Seed of Corruption. It's so clunky. Demonic Servitude, same it is now. Permanent Doomguard and Infernal, and I cheer at that because I've always wanted a permanent one. And I was really happy to see that this expansion. I'm glad that we were able to keep that going forward. So that's it for the talents. As far as any semblance of rotation goes, it's pretty much keep the 3 to 4 dots up, use Unstable Affliction with procs, and spam your Drain Life in between. If you have Haunt, cast it on cooldown. In general, you'll be doing a lot more dot refreshing than in the past, which means you won't be doing as much Drain Life spam. That's about it for the changes to Affliction Discover thus far. I plan to do a similar breakdown for Destro and Demo whenever Demo gets fleshed out. So stay tuned and subscribe. Thank you for watching.